you are armed and present at the Glenmont metro station, I implore you to shoot me. Aim for a headshot. Target my temple, angling slightly downward. I need the bullet to traverse the shortest conceivable path through my brain before striking my hippocampus. If fortune favors me, the sensation of the gunshot tearing through my skull might endure for just a few decades. As horrendous as this plea may sound, you would be performing an immense kindness. Death by a headshot, immediately, is immeasurably preferable to the alternative. My torment began over 10 millennia ago, precisely at 10:15 this morning. I augment my earnings by partaking in drug trials. I'm designated a healthy subject, testing experimental medications to assess potential side effects. Sometimes it's a kidney medication, other times blood pressure or cholesterol treatments. This morning they informed me that the substance I ingested was a psychoactive compound designed to enhance brain function. Previously, none of the drugs I've tried had any recreational effects on me. In other words, none of them induced a strong buzz or relaxation. It's possible I've always ended up in the placebo group, as none of the substances seemed to affect me in any way. However, today's experience deviated from the norm. This particular compound worked profoundly. They administered a pill at 10:15 and instructed me to remain in the waiting area until summoned for tests. It should only be about 30 minutes, a research assistant informed me. I reclined on the waiting room sofa and read a few articles from a Psychology Today magazine left on the coffee table. When they hadn't summoned me after I finished reading that, I picked up a copy of U.S. News and read it cover to cover. I then perused an old issue of Scientific American. I couldn't help but wonder what was causing the delay. I lethargically turned my head to inspect the wall clock. It was just 10:23 a.m. In those 8 minutes I had read through all. I surveyed the selection of old books and selected a copy of Moby Dick. My arms displayed the same sluggishness as my legs. Even reaching out a foot to grasp the book demanded significant time. The monotony of waiting for my hand to finally make contact with the book's spine left me genuinely bored. Returning to the couch, I lowered myself onto it in a gradual descent, akin to the deliberate lunar leaps of astronauts. I opened Moby Dick with a leisurely pace and commenced reading. Starting with the famous line, "Call me Ishmael," I progressed until Ahab discarded his pipe into the ocean, a passage that happened to be situated all the way in chapter 30. They hadn't called me back yet when I reached this point. "How are you feeling?" the research assistant inquired upon my return. "I feel sluggish," I responded. "Actually, it's the reverse. Everything seems slow because your speed of thought is so swift." "But my legs, my arms, they're moving in slow motion." "Your physical actions appear slow because your mental processes are rapid. Your brain functions at 10 or 20 times its usual pace. Your thoughts and perception of reality are accelerated. Nonetheless, your body adheres to biomechanical laws. In truth, you're moving significantly faster than an average individual," she illustrated with a jogging gesture. "However, due to your heightened mental activity, even your brisk walking seems exceptionally leisurely." Recalling my gradual flop onto the waiting room couch, I recognized the inconsistency. Even if my muscle movements had decelerated, my body's interaction with gravity would remain unchanged. Yet in the waiting room, I even descended in slow motion. Sluggish muscles couldn't account for this sense of reduced gravity. My mind was operating at an extraordinary pace. That's why I could read 3 magazines, and the initial 30-chapter cognitive tests were less enjoyable but revealing. Solve a 50-word word search, 3 seconds. Navigate an intricate maze drawn on a poster-sized paper, 2 seconds. Watch a slideshow displaying 10 images per second, and answer in-depth questions about the content, 95% accuracy. They informed me that I registered over 250 on the KNOP scale, indicative of superhuman cognitive processing. Then they sent me home saying, "It will subside in a few hours, though it may feel like days to you. Use the residual effects to accomplish some tasks. Catch up on work emails while your mental velocity is elevated." The journey home was excruciating. Merely 3 metro stops, spanning around 35 minutes in real-world time, felt like days to me. Days. Just walking from the medical research area to the elevator appeared to take an hour. I dashed out of the office, urging my legs to propel me faster. However, the laws of biomechanics imprisoned me. Even with my accelerated mental state, I couldn't prompt my legs to operate at an increased pace. The profound disconnect between my mind and body made gauging when to slow down, turn, or adjust my body's orientation immensely challenging. I had essentially transformed into an enormous, slow-motion, awkward figure. I miscalculated my speed and collided into the wall beside the elevator button at a substantial velocity. Despite witnessing the wall approaching, my finger extended to press the button failed to retreat swiftly enough, and I collided with the wall. The pain was intense. Had my mental speed been standard, the discomfort might have subsided within half a minute. Yet within my accelerated state, the intense agony persisted for what felt like half an hour, or maybe even 45 minutes. The elevator ride was agonizing. The descent of 7 floors lasted for what seemed like 4 or 5 hours, offering naught but the interior of the elevator car for observation. I rushed toward the metro station. I admit this part was almost enjoyable. Despite my body's perceived super slow rate of motion, I retained the capacity to meticulously select where to place my feet, swing my arms, and pivot my torso. After a block or two, I acclimated to having a mind operating 24 times faster than my physical form. Subsequently, I effectively sprint danced the remainder of the journey, evading pedestrians on the sidewalk with a skillful dance and dodging vehicles by the narrowest of margins, resembling minutes of clearance. I dedicated an hour, according to my internal time frame, to descending into the subway and reaching the platform. The monotony of waiting the 6 minutes for the arrival of the Red Line train was nearly insufferable. While the metro platform offered more stimuli compared to the elevator, the tedium persisted. I wished I had taken that copy of Moby Dick. The Red Line train pulled into the station, appearing to move in slow motion. The normally high-pitched squeal of the brakes transposed into a deep, resonant tone in my heightened state. However, it wasn't just the train's piercing squeal that exhibited this shift. All sound was reduced nearly to inaudibility. Voices faded, descending below the threshold of audibility. Amid this symphony of slowed sound, I managed to discern the cries of a wailing infant within the subway car. Her shrieks resembled the songs of whales. Sharp sounds like car horns and the clatter of trucks over potholes mutated into low, indistinct roars, reminiscent of distant thunder. Upon returning to the research premises, I maintained the ability to hear and interact with the research staff. However, my capacity for verbal communication with others deteriorated. The effects of the drugs continued to intensify. I spent what felt like days aboard that interminable Red Line train. Days, listening to the whale-like song of the crying infant and the tuba-like solo of the brakes. While ordinary speech was shifted beyond my auditory range, odors seemed unaffected. I didn't become nose-blind to relief washed over me as I stood in my home. At least I had activities to engage in here. I grabbed the book I was reading, 100 Years of Solitude, and completed it. Even though I tore many pages while rapidly flipping through them, it seemed that most of the time spent finishing the book was devoted to turning pages rather than actual reading. A mere 3 minutes had elapsed since my return home. I attempted to surf the internet. The eternity required for modern computers to boot up is frustrating, but the sluggish pace proved unbearable. Each new page took hours, as it seemed to me, to load, while reading it consumed only a fraction of a second. 100 news articles in my feed were consumed, yet only 3 more minutes had passed. Turning to my pile of unread books, I completed 2 more. 4 more minutes of time elapsed. I decided to use the remaining effects of the drug to attempt sleep. Regrettably, the portion of my mind governing perception, which had been accelerated to incredible speeds by the drug, was distinct from the aspect responsible for sleep. Despite perceiving the passage of what felt like days, my physical brain still perceived the time as 1:25 p.m., far from being ready for slumber. Regardless, I endeavored to sleep. Walking to my bedroom, a slow 45-minute drift through my apartment, I eased onto my bed, gentle as a feather's descent to the mattress. I shut my eyes and lay there for hours and hours, in real time, merely 10 minutes, before abandoning the endeavor. Sleep refused to embrace me. I confronted a prospect of time that would seem like centuries, or perhaps even eons, trapped within the confines of a sluggish, perpetual motion. Therefore, I ingested an Ambien. The experience of swallowing the pill and the sensation of water flowing down my throat felt nauseating, a lump obstructing my breath sluggishly traversing my esophagus. I immersed myself in a book. 10 minutes elapsed. Another book. 18 minutes since taking the Ambien. In disgust and frustration, I hurled the book across the room. It twirled slowly in the air, reminiscent of a leaf drifting on a gentle breeze. Eventually, it struck the wall with a faint, extended rumble, then descended to the floor, as if sinking into a swimming pool. The gravitational force remained unaltered since the ingestion of the pill. The laws of physics endured. My perception of time had simply turned incomprehensible. Consequently, I utilized the pace at which objects fell as a gauge of the drug's impact. Estimating the duration it took for the book to descend to the floor, I inferred that the drug's effects were still amplifying. I read a magazine. It was 10 minutes later. I switched on the television. I perceived each frame of video as if it were a slideshow. Frustrated, I powered off the television. I resumed reading. The initial 2 books of Churchill's A History of the English-Speaking Peoples were completed. Not exactly light reading. I despised it, truth be told. Yet, considering the hours of monotony required to retrieve another book from my shelf, I chose to remain on the couch, begrudgingly reading Churchill, or at least tolerating it slightly more. It had now been 35 minutes since I ingested the Ambien. I lay down on the couch and closed my eyes. Time passed. Inhalation occurred, a process stretching across hours. Time passed. Exhalation unfolded for additional hours. Sleep remained elusive. No matter how much I willed it, my physical brain perceived the time as 1:25 p.m., unprepared for slumber. Nonetheless, a new strategy beckoned. I resolved to return to the research facility where I consumed the drug. Perhaps they possessed a remedy to counteract its effects, or at least a means to induce unconsciousness until the drug's influence subsided. I departed my apartment as rapidly as possible, an effort consuming hours in my subjective experience. I neglected to even lock the door, as such a task would have proven intolerably time-consuming. Descending the stairs, preferable to the elevator when one sprints, traversing the lobby, exiting the front door, and stepping onto the street. All these actions required what felt like an entire workday. Sprinting down the street, executing intricate maneuvers to weave around pedestrians with seemingly superhuman finesse. Descending the first set of stairs at the metro, across the landing. The Ambien did not induce drowsiness, not in the least. Instead, it triggered a potent reaction with the experimental substance I consumed earlier. I was dashing down the stairs, progressing in slow motion yet making observable advancements. Abruptly, everything ceased. The ambient street and metro sounds fell silent, replaced by an impeccably profound silence I had never encountered. My downward trajectory appeared to halt entirely. Prior to the Ambien's impact, my perception of time was perhaps a few hundred times slower than real time. Post-Ambien, time's pace slowed thousands of times over. Every second extended into days within my perception. Even the act of shifting my gaze to focus on a different point unfolded as an impossibly gradual journey across my visual field. In the span of the next few minutes, I acquired the skill of walking, running, and leaping when my thoughts were running hundreds of times faster than my bodily motions. However, the Ambien-induced slowdown amplified the challenge. Managing my muscles proved almost impossible. I plummeted on the stairs. Even as my movements hovered in midair, controlling my muscles remained unattainable. I implored my foot to move forward for hours, then reversed the instruction to ensure I wouldn't miss the next step. Hours elapsed as I struggled to adjust the angle of my ankle, subsequently readjusting when the adjustment seemed amiss. Despite these efforts, my ankle twisted on the subsequent step. Pain surfaced, unmitigated by the temporal shift. Hours of mounting strain on my bent ankle culminated in hours of exacerbated pain layered upon pain. I propelled forward, my mind operating at warp speed yet helpless to command my slow-moving body. I descended for what felt like days, managing to rotate my torso sufficiently to avoid landing head first. Ultimately, I alit on my right shoulder. Initially, the impact was scarcely noticeable. Gradually, I detected a mild pressure in my shoulder upon contact with the ground. Over time, this pressure transformed into escalating pain, expanding for hour upon hour. Eventually, my shoulder yielded, dislocating with an excruciating, unending tug. Time ticked by, and I finally ground to a halt, slumped on the ground, gazing upwards at the ceiling. The anguish in my shoulder persisted, a relentless reminder of the injury. I had ample time to contemplate my predicament during that extended descent. If every second equated to days in my perception, a minute in real-world time would stretch into years. Even if the drug's effects vanished in the ensuing 2 or 3 hours, this ordeal would extend for what felt like centuries. As I settled upon the ground, a plan formulated within me. I would somehow reach the platform and throw myself in front of an approaching train. I twisted onto my hands and knees, enduring the agony radiating from my dislocated shoulder. Misjudging my rotation, I rolled onto my back. A renewed attempt allowed me to stabilize on all fours, overcoming the obstacles of time's distortion. If achieving such a basic posture was this arduous, the notion of walking or running seemed an unattainable fantasy. Thus, I resorted to crawling. Through the metro tunnel, my journey unfolded in an agonizing crawl, persisting for weeks. I captured countless bewildered expressions from the commuters, their faces frozen in a perpetual state of astonishment. The turnstile proved navigable in this position, and I soon found myself on the escalator. The escalator released its riders onto the platform, an action resembling the leisurely descent of ice into the ocean. My gaze swept across the platform as I descended, subjected to a slow-motion stream of humanity. The train status display indicated a 20-minute wait for the next train. 20 minutes, an eternity in my perception. A year-long stint on the platform loomed ahead, awaiting my demise. Disembarking from the escalator, I navigated the crowd, wrestling with time's relentless crawl. A few feet carried me to a concrete bench where I curled up, striving to ease the torment emanating from my shoulder. Then, time took a turn for the worse. Inexplicably worse. The extraordinary slowdown experienced on the stairs was but a precursor to the interaction between the experimental drug and the Ambien. The Ambien's full impact struck me as I lay beside the bench. I blinked. Years of darkness followed. Sound had already vanished, and now my sight followed suit. All that endured was the anguish from my fall. My accelerated mind promptly compensated for the absence of sensory input. Voices conversed with me, singing in languages never known. Patterns, faces, and hues danced within my mind's eye. My entire life played out before me, a spectrum of experiences extending into an imagined future. English escaped my memory, despair embraced me wholeheartedly, conversations with deities ensued. I ascended to the status of a deity myself, birthing entire universes with my thoughts. Then I replicated the feat again and again. Eons later, my eyes reopened, uncoiling with geological slowness. A faint glow emerged. Weeks elapsed. A thin beam of light materialized. Weeks more passed. A slender view of the metro platform. The ankles of commuters near me and an advertisement on the distant wall. With great effort, I retrieved my phone from my pocket, a feat spanning decades. How can I even articulate the tedium? The pain in my shoulder paled in comparison to the sheer monotony. Every thought that could be thought had been exhausted countless times. The view of ankles and advertisements remained a constant, unchanging. Unchanging for what felt like eons. The boredom metamorphosed into an entity, palpable as a solid structure of metal and stone lodged within my skull. Unavoidable. What were my options? If I were to crawl and tumble onto the tracks without an approaching train to end my life, I would endure more agony from the fall. Chances were high that I would be rescued by a well-intentioned individual on the platform and unable to act when the train finally rolled in. Such suffering would be interminable. Thus I awaited the train, a train that would facilitate my leap into its path. Upon impact, I would undergo the torment of being torn asunder for centuries, until life's light extinguished from my mind and my experience concluded. Lifetimes appeared to pass as I persisted at the foot of that bench. In spirit, I outlived any human in history. Most of my existence transpired as a snapshot of anguish, huddled on the subway platform, an unchanging view of ankles and advertisements. This post embodies my backup plan, my last-ditch effort. I expended lifetimes composing and publishing this message in the hopes that someone would read it and comprehend that my suffering must cease. Perhaps someone here on this platform. Someone who would encounter the figure beneath the bench, the individual who crawled down the escalator, and dispatch him swiftly, a bullet to the temple. If you possess a firearm and are present at the Glenmont metro station, I implore you to end my suffering.